Please treat the wound, and I promise to repay you later." When I returned from shopping, I found my granddaughter, Alice, covered in blood, crouching in front of our entrance, waiting for us. My husband and I rushed to her, but my husband pushed him away, telling me, "Don't let her into the house. It will only bring trouble." Alice stood there, stunned. I wondered how things had come to this. I could only stand helplessly in front of the blood-covered Alice and my trembling, angry husband. My name is Grace. With my husband, who is 2 years my senior, I run a liquor store that has been passed down through generations. We have no days off because the store is busy, but we support each other and live a peaceful life. We have a son who was good at both studies and sports from childhood. He always topped his class in elementary and middle school. And he went to the top high school in our area, where he continued to achieve high grades. Moreover, he joined the tennis club and even won a tennis tournament he participated in. He was admitted to college on a recommendation and joined the tennis club while actively volunteering. His attitude was well regarded, and during job hunting, he secured an offer from a major listed company faster than anyone else. Honestly, I had hoped he would take over the liquor store. But it seemed he had no intention of doing so. Although I felt a bit disappointed, I wholeheartedly supported him as he happily talked about his job in marketing, which he had studied in college. Our son, who excelled at a major corporation, was our pride. He moved into an apartment near his company when he started his job. It wasn't too far to commute from home, but he said, "I need to stand on my own now that I'm a working adult," and left home. However, when I heard that he was too busy to cook for himself, I told him he could always come home. During his first year, he came home almost daily, joyfully saying, "Nothing beats mom's cooking." But as the years went by, he became busier, and his visits decreased. I worried whether he was eating properly and reached out to him several times. But his responses were irritable and brief. Now, even when he comes home, he spends most of his time on his computer, and we hardly talk. "Don't overdo it, okay?" I called out to my son, but he responded indifferently. Feeling a gap growing between us, I refrained from interfering in his work. And years later, one day, he suddenly brought home a young woman. She looked young, and there seemed to be an age gap between her and my son. She stood behind my son and avoided eye contact with us. Despite feeling uneasy about her attitude, I led them into the living room. "So, who is this lady?" When I asked my son, he introduced her as his wife, and she greeted. To my surprise, they were already married, and she was pregnant. Although I was perplexed, the thought of having a grandchild made me happy. Thinking that the upcoming grandchild might bridge the gap I had felt with my son in recent years, we congratulated them. In the end, the woman did not speak much. But I secretly hoped that becoming a mother might change her attitude. The following year, a healthy baby girl, Alice, was born. She was truly adorable, and we quickly became smitten with her. As we had hoped, my son and his wife started contacting us more after she was born. They relied on us because they were inexperienced with parenting. Although our first impression of the daughter-in-law was nearly the worst, she began to seek advice from me through Alice. My daughter-in-law was still not very talkative, but I could feel her trying her best to be a good mother. It seemed that my son and his wife had moved close to our house, and they began visiting us frequently, leading to my house very lively. Sometimes they would leave the child with us and go out by themselves. But I was pleased by this because it meant our relationship was good. As Alice started attending kindergarten, I was tasked with picking her up daily. My son was still busy with work, but his wife, being a stay-at-home mom, should have had time to pick her up. What on earth is she doing? We are busier than they think. Going to pick her up meant leaving the liquor store, and with heavy liquor bottles everywhere? I couldn't just leave her there. Balancing grandparenting duties with our work was a struggle. I casually asked my daughter-in-law about picking her up, but she evaded the question. And it became a norm that we would do it. Moreover, I had to feed the child dinner and bathe her as well. There were days when the daughter-in-law would come to pick her up only around bedtime. Or she would stay the night. I thought it was a pity for Alice, so I tried to talk to my son and his wife. But they wouldn't take it seriously. She's attached to you guys, so it's fine, right? As much as Alice was attached to us, we couldn't speak too strongly. The burden lessened somewhat as she entered elementary school. I got completely used to her coming to our house instead of the apartment which she lived in with her parents. One day, as the year-end approached, that was the busiest period for the liquor store. My son, who was raised in the liquor store, should have understood this. But he suddenly called, asking us to take care of her during the New Year's period. That's impossible. You know this is our busiest time. We can't take care of her. I refused firmly, but my son immediately became sullen and hung up the phone unilaterally. I tried calling back several times, but he didn't answer. Although I hadn't expected it, on the morning of December 30th, my son and his wife really brought Alice. They rang the intercom repeatedly. And I could hear her calling for my husband and me at the entrance. My son had probably instructed her to do this to get us to open the door. It was heartbreaking to see her brought over on a cold early morning like this. So we reluctantly opened the door. My son pushed Alice, who was wearing a large backpack, towards us, and left with his wife. I asked Alice where her parents were going, but she just shook her head, saying she didn't know. She was in elementary school, but she still couldn't manage everything on her own. Amid the busyness that sometimes made us even forget our own meals, we took care of her meals and baths. She played alone or did her homework quietly, perhaps out of consideration for us. It's such a pity, especially during the winter break. However, our shop is closed on New Year's Day, so we played cards and board games together. Alice seemed to enjoy playing, but I felt guilty that this was all we could do for her. I wondered where my son and his wife had gone, leaving their daughter behind. We found that out on January 4th, when things had finally settled down at work. They finally returned from their trip with several shopping bags in their hands, dragging a large suitcase. We're back. I had a blast in Cancun. I couldn't help but exclaim in surprise, "What? What do you mean? Did you two go on a trip?" When I confronted my son, he nonchalantly nodded. I got a reservation at a popular hotel through a senior's connection. We had to go. My son and his wife talked about how amazing the hotel was, but I couldn't care less. Even my husband, who had been silently listening, finally reached his limit and interrupted them. "We've been patient because we love Alice, but you two rely on us too much. We can help to some extent, but we also have the liquor store to consider. Plus, it's sad for her to be left alone on holidays." My son immediately snapped back loudly. "It's just a poor liquor store. No customers would come anyway. It's good enough just to take care of your grandchild, huh?" After saying this, my son called out loudly for Alice. She immediately came out from another room with her belongings. My daughter-in-law, glaring at us, grabbed her hand and led her outside. "Hey, we're not done talking." My husband tried to stop my son, but he quickly followed his wife out. They left hurriedly without looking back. Only Alice looked back at us, waving her little hand, but her figure gradually disappeared from view. Since that day, we'd had no contact from my son and his wife. And Alice stopped visiting our home after school. Concerned about her, a month later, I decided to visit the apartment where they lived. Although my husband was sad not to see Alice, he was also angry with my son. So I went to the apartment alone. However, no matter how many times I rang the intercom, no one answered. Maybe they're not home? Despite thinking this, I couldn't give up and stayed at the door for a while. Then, a couple living next door returned home. They greeted me briefly and hesitantly informed me that the three had moved out. Shocked, I immediately called my son's mobile. Perhaps because he was at work, he didn't answer. I also tried calling my daughter-in-law, but she didn't answer either. I couldn't believe they had moved without telling us. If they were upset about what happened the other day, I was ready to apologize and wanted to have a proper discussion. I left a message on my son's answering machine. But neither he nor my daughter-in-law returned my calls. Where could they have gone? While there were many concerns, there was nothing I could do if I couldn't reach them. I had gotten into the habit of looking towards the store's entrance around the time Alice used to return from school, hoping she might come back. I spent my days hoping that she was safe and well. One day, on the store's closed day, my husband suggested we go shopping in town to cheer me up since I was feeling down about not seeing Alice. I'm ready to buy whatever you want. Grateful for my husband's kind gesture, I enjoyed shopping for the first time in a while. He bought me a new dress for going out, and he got himself a new shirt. Afterward, we had coffee at a cafe before heading home. Then, I saw someone sitting in front of the store. Although the person was facing down, I immediately recognized it was Alice. I called out her name and ran towards her. Hearing my voice, she looked up and quietly said, "Grandma." As she stood up, my husband and I gasped. Her clothes were stained with blood here and there. "Please treat the wound, and I promise to repay you later," Alice pleaded as she said this. Shocked to hear such formal words from Alice, who used to be so affectionate with us. I was about to bring her inside for treatment when my husband shouted, "Don't let her in." I was startled, thinking that my husband still hadn't forgiven my son and his wife. Alice trembled, perhaps out of fear, as she had never heard him raise his voice before. As I hugged her, I noticed she had become much thinner than I remembered. My husband took out his mobile phone and began making a call. "It seems my grandchild is seriously injured. Please come right away." It appeared he was calling an ambulance. His earlier words must have meant that it was not the time for leisurely treatment because of the blood-stained clothes, indicating a serious injury. "Grandma and Grandpa are here with you." We sat Alice down in front of the store again to reassure her. As we hugged her while waiting for the ambulance, Alice took something out of her pocket and handed it to me. "The recording." She said only that before closing her eyes. Soon, I could hear her breathing evenly, indicating she had fallen asleep. Relieved, I exhaled deeply. After the ambulance arrived and took us to the hospital, I tried calling my son to inform him about the emergency and the hospital location but got no response. I left a message on his voicemail. While Alice received treatment and underwent some tests, it became clear she was severely weakened. That was just what I had felt when I had hugged her. She would need to stay in the hospital for a few days. And I left another message for my son to prepare for her hospitalization. After the treatments and tests, she continued to sleep. My husband and I sat beside her bed, watching over her much thinner sleeping face. As I was about to pull out a handkerchief because I started to cry, my hand touched something hard in my bag. It was the kid's smartphone that she had handed to me. "Hey, you. This I showed the kid's smartphone to my husband, and we decided to turn it on. It seemed the service had expired, so the phone and email functions were no longer working. Yet, Alice had given it to us, trying to communicate something. There must be something here. As we examined the smartphone, we found something. Realizing it was what she wanted to tell us, we trembled with anger. After a while, she woke up, but she looked dazed and didn't know where she was. "You're awake. We're at the hospital." After I spoke, she looked at us. We stroked her head and hands, wanting to comfort her, and asked what had happened. Alice immediately looked scared and started looking around. "Where are Mom and Dad? They aren't here." "Don't worry. Tell us what happened." Hearing this, Alice began to cry. She must have been hurt a lot on her way to us today and become frightened of adults. Remembering her stern voice in front of the store, we cried along with her. When her tears subsided, Alice started talking about what had happened since we couldn't see her. "My son quit his job at the beginning of the year and tried to start a business. The trip to Cancun over the New Year's was apparently financed by his severance pay. A senior who had arranged the hotel in Cancun helped him with the startup. But this senior betrayed him, and his company went bankrupt quickly, leaving him with a huge debt. Frustrated, my son and his wife began to take it out on Alice, who was not given proper meals and became weakened. She had not been allowed to go to school for days, but somehow managed to escape and came to us for help." After finishing her story, Alice started crying loudly again. We gently hugged her and rubbed her back. Just then, my son and his wife, likely having heard the voicemail, rushed in. Seeing them unprepared for the hospital stay as I had instructed, I sighed in exasperation. They called her name as if worried, and approached the bed saying they would take her home right away. "What are you talking about? She's going to stay in the hospital for a while. Didn't you listen to the voicemail? You're overreacting. She just fell and got hurt, right? That can't be true. Her clothes were covered in blood." My son excused that Alice had poor grades and they had fought. He said she had fallen when she ran out of the house after the fight. "Right, isn't it?" Asked by my son, Alice nodded with a frightened look. "See? We're taking her home today." My son tried to push us aside and forcibly pick up Alice from the bed. We stood between my son and Alice to protect her, glaring at him and his wife. "What's the matter?" Seeing our stance, my son and his wife stepped back hesitantly. "We know everything." Indeed, what Alice wanted to tell us was about the mistreatment from my son and his wife. And it was recorded on the kid's smartphone. It had a recording function, and she had recorded many abuses hurled at her by them. We played the horrific verbal abuse for my son and his wife to hear. Even after hearing it, they started to react aggressively, insisting they did nothing wrong. "Shut up." As my son shouted and pushed my husband, 2 police officers entered the room. I had called the police while Alice was still unconscious, and they had been waiting outside the hospital room. The unruly son and his wife were taken away by the officers. At that time, the kid's smartphone was handed over to the police as evidence, ensuring my son and his wife could not return home easily. Months have passed since then. Alice has fully recovered and is now living with us. My son and his wife have been charged with child neglect and, apparently, involved in fraud to repay their debts, facing further charges and currently in prison. Though it was my own son who caused this, I felt no sympathy. I just felt sorry for Alice and sad about how things turned out. When we first took her in, I apologized for becoming distant, but she thanked us instead. "Thank you for saving me from Mom and Dad. I've always loved you, Grandma and Grandpa." Alice's bright spirit seemed to blow away all our worries. Recently, she started helping out in the store right after school, and is enthusiastic about taking over the liquor store in the future. It seems the hopes, which we once had for our son, will be fulfilled by my grandchild. We look forward to that day with great anticipation.